Sonic X Shadow Generations is a game that had a lot of mystery in the pre-release, and even after playing it, there still is some mysteries. For example, during Sonic and Shadow Generations, what exactly was Silver the Hedgehog up to? The reason why the mystery of Silver the Hedgehog's whereabouts during Sonic Generations is more relevant than ever is because of the inclusion of the Shadow Generations remaster. While Sonic and his little buddy Classic Sonic were running around and frolicking through their past adventures, this dude Shadow was literally fighting every single demon from his past and reliving all of his traumatic memories. Now that we've been provided a lot of context for Shadow's appearance in the story as well as the reason for why Sonic and Shadow fight, one could only naturally assume that Silver is going through something similar, and potentially during the Time Eater saga, he's been going on an adventure of his own. Maybe one day this could lead to something like a Silver Generations DLC or whatever you want to call it. We'd love to know exactly what this guy was up to and why he was so pressed by Sonic in this story. You know, Silver also had a Chaos Emerald, similar to Shadow. I mean, it was a significant plot device for the Shadow portion of the game. So what's up with that? How did he obtain that? There is definitely one clue. Silver has dialogue that says, Sonic, is that you? Or are you some kind of fake sent for the Chaos Emeralds? Who are these fakes that Silver could be talking about? We know that in the challenge acts that there's doppelganger races, so maybe those things are actually canon to the story and they've been tormenting Silver. I mean, hey, if you think about it, Mephiles returned in Shadow Generation, so anything is possible, right? Perhaps wherever Silver is for most of this story, maybe Infinite has returned and he's using the Phantom Ruby to create clones. Who knows, right? That's because it's a mystery. The possibilities are endless. No pun intended. Here's the next unsolved mystery from Sonic and Shadow Generations. Who exactly is Professor Victoria? It's time to do some time travel. No pun intended. Nearly 3 years ago, Sega shocked the world when Tails revealed his true master plan, which was to become a Twitch streamer. And thus, the Tails Tube series was born. One of the segments in the original Tails Tube was highlighting the human characters of the Sonic universe. While all the other characters looked familiar, there was one purple-haired girl that set the Sonic fanbase ablaze. Keep in mind, this Tails Tube and the reveal of the purple-haired girl was prior to the release of Sonic Frontiers, so a lot of people were speculating as to whether or not she would play a role in the game. It turns out that that could not be further from the truth, as she did not appear in Sonic Frontiers. As a matter of fact, she didn't appear in the Sonic franchise for years. We know she had some level of significance to the franchise because when someone asked Ian Flynn about who she is, he responded with his infamous knowing smile, which means he knows more to the project than he's allowed to let on. But still, we didn't hear anything about Professor Victoria for multiple years. That is, of course, until nearly 3 years later she appeared in the background of Sonic Movie 3. The fanbase was once again going crazy, and just when you thought it couldn't get even crazier, in the most recent Tails Tube, it all came full circle, where a book called The Mystery of History by Professor Victoria featuring the same purple-haired girl appeared. So how is Professor Victoria's existence an unsolved mystery from Sonic and Shadow Generations? Well, Gerald Robotnik had a journal that you could unlock pages of in Sonic and Shadow Generations, which reveals a lot of interesting backstory to Shadow's development, Space Colony arc, Gerald Robotnik, Maria, their family life, and honestly, it's quite fascinating some of the things that they include in this. The journal in of itself was obtained by none other than Professor Victoria, and we know this because Abraham Tower, aka the Gun Commander, had requested this information, and we know this is Professor Victoria because at the end, it was signed T. However, in the Japanese version of the game, it was translated to Professor Tori. Tori is short for Victoria. So it looks like Professor Victoria has some connection to Gun, and she even obtained Gerald Robotnik's journal. However, it remains to be seen what her role is going to be in the franchise. Here's the next mystery. How did Black Doom appear prior to the arrival of the Time Eater? The reason why this is somewhat of a mystery because prior to the Time Eater destroying the timeline and converting everything into white space, Shadow was on a mission to Space Colony Arc because he detected a presence from Black Doom in the Black Arms. The most reasonable explanation for this would be that the Time Eater just revived Black Doom, but based off of the first cutscene in Sonic and Shadow Generations, we know that Black Doom's presence existed prior to the Time Eater's arrival. In the second cutscene of the game, that is when the Time Eater actually arrives and destroys the timeline. So how could it be that someone who was defeated from the past is returning despite the time anomaly not happening yet? So here's the best explanation, but also there's still a couple questions that I have. So in the Dark Beginnings animation prologue, we know that there was a Doom's Eye larva type thing that was left on Space Colony Arc, and we know this because in the post-credit scenes of Shadow Generations Dark Beginnings, we know that at the very end, Black Doom is revealed to be on the Space Colony Arc hiding, almost like he was revived. There's only so much that we know concrete without having to make educated guesses. Now, it's certainly possible the Time Eater's presence is what triggered Black Doom's revival, although Black Doom himself claims that it was only speeding up the process. So that's basically the question at hand. Was Black Doom going to revive with or without the Time Eater? We have a lot of information speculation, but we can only guess what the true answer is. Here's the next mystery. Is Shadow Eggman's uncle? So the Robotnik family tree was always an interesting one, and we have more on that later. So this was always kind of a thing when you analyze the Robotnik family tree, but there's new dialogue in Sonic and Shadow Generations that, in my opinion, makes it like kind of official.
It is time.
I'm sorry I put you on this path, Shadow, but I'm proud of how you have walked it. I believe in you, son.
We never really knew what the extent of Shadow and Gerald's true relationship was. Was Shadow just one of his random science experiments? Well, the answer to that is Gerald considers Shadow to be one of his sons. Now he's an official member of the family, and that would make him Dr. Eggman's uncle. The question is really now at this point whether Shadow considers Eggman to be his nephew, or if Eggman even accepts Shadow as his uncle. You know what else that means? Eggman's other uncle is the Bio-Lizard. Talk about a dysfunctional family. Let's move on to the next mystery. Here's the next mystery. Where was Metal Sonic during the events of Sonic and Shadow Generations? It's only a fair question to ask what exactly Metal Sonic was up to during the events of Sonic Generations, because now we know, based off of Shadow's backstory, there's a lot more going on in this white space than meets the eye, at least based off of the previous context that we had. It's multifaceted and also interesting. We know that Silver is definitely up to something during the events of Sonic Generations. We also know that Shadow is up to something, and obviously Sonic and Classic Sonic had their path, but Metal Sonic is also someone that you encounter in white space. So what exactly was his path? What was he going through during the events of this? Imagine they dropped DLC for Sonic and Shadow Generations, either episode Metal or episode Silver or both. That would certainly be cool. Also, another bonus mystery is how exactly could Metal Sonic talk in Sonic Generations when we know that Metal Sonic is not allowed to talk unless he is Neo Metal Sonic? Let's move on to the next one. Here's the next mystery. How does Mephiles remember the events of Sonic 06? During the reveal trailer for Sonic and Shadow Generations, the world was shocked when a fan favorite villain, Mephiles, had returned. To truly understand this mystery, you need to have full context to Mephiles' backstory. So Mephiles, when combined with Iblis, becomes Solaris, which is canonically the strongest villain in the Sonic franchise, a godlike being that could quote-unquote eat dimensions for lunch. The thing about Mephiles' existence in of itself is that Shadow the Hedgehog is actually responsible for Mephiles being initially released into the world. So I'd like to paint a picture for you. So we have Sonic 06 right here. Shadow waltzes into Sonic 06 and at some point travels back into the past, which creates Mephiles the Dark. Fast forward into the present, we have all of the events of Sonic 06, and let's say the heroes don't defeat Mephiles, we would have maybe a post 06 timeline, or maybe no timeline. But after Solaris is defeated and Sonic and Elise go back into the past, they actually erase the events of the Project Solaris. So that would mean that Mephiles never existed, which means there's no post 06 timeline, and now we have the current timeline. So with that being said, Mephiles should never have existed in the first place, and Mephiles even says the bone-chilling and infamous line in Sonic and Shadow Generations himself.
There is no future for you. Ever.
So what I do find interesting about all this is that yes, Mephiles technically doesn't exist, but he's kind of lurking outside of the timeline. If all the events of 06 were erased, then technically that should be true, although he appears in this game and seems to remember all of the events. It's a little confusing, which is why I kind of hate time travel in a way, because it creates a little bit of these paradoxes, but also in a way, I kind of like the idea of Mephiles kind of existing outside of the timeline as this like omnipotent threat, similar to like Ganondorf in the Zelda series. It's hard one way or another to make sense of it all, and while we can certainly point to evidence and theories and speculation, and we could almost get a concrete answer, it's technically not defined by Sonic Team, so at this point, it's still an unsolved mystery. Here's the next mystery. Who is Maria's sister? So here we are back discussing the interesting Robotnik family dynamic. It's been discovered in Gerald's journal that Maria now has a little sister back home on Earth that was just recently born. As a matter of fact, if you go up to Maria and talk to her in the game, she will also say that she misses her family and she misses her baby sister as well. So who is Maria's sister? It's still still currently an unsolved mystery from Sonic and Shadow Generations, but there's a big fan theory going on right now that the new Professor Victoria could potentially be Maria's baby sister. It's all certainly interesting, and the Robotnik family tree is certainly a mess. We don't know exactly who Professor Victoria is, but if she turns out to be a long-lost Robotnik, I think that would be pretty sick. Here's the next mystery. Who is Dr. Eggman's father? So on today's episode, we discovered that Shadow the Hedgehog is Eggman's uncle, but the better question is, who is his actual dad? Funny enough, if you head into the collection room and you open up Gerald's journal, you will see two of his sons. One of them is into archaeology and the other one is into robotics. You can only imagine which one is Dr. Eggman's father. Honestly, in my opinion, I think the one on the right with his little mean mug grill kind of looks like Eggman's dad, but it remains to be seen. What's even more sad and tragic about the Robotnik family tree is that since Maria had a terminal illness and she was whisked away to Space Colony Ark to try and find a cure, there was clearly a rift that was growing between Eggman's family and Gerald. Eventually, they were no longer on speaking terms, and they even had another granddaughter and obviously Dr. Eggman as a grandson. And we all know how it ended for Gerald and Maria, so it truly is this tragic family backstory. It kind of makes sense that Dr. Eggman ended up being this evil mastermind. It's because he had this really messed up family. It's pretty easy to understand how Maria's illness and her being taken away from her family probably caused a huge rift and divide. And we get a glimpse into the Eggman family life because during the fishing minigame in Sonic Frontiers, you can fish up Eggman's diary. And he talks about how he never met his cousin Maria, but he was pretty much neglected because everyone seemed to focus their attention on her and talk about how great she was. So a further expansion onto this dynamic, like I said before, would be awesome. If Professor Tori ends up being a Robotnik, we're certainly in for something really cool. Here's the next mystery. When does Rouge the Bat swap the fake Chaos Emerald with the real Chaos Emerald? Easily the best part of Sonic and Shadow Generations is when we get the crossover between Sonic and Shadow stories, kind of like the old days. We finally get context as to why Sonic and Shadow are fighting, which again, like we spoke about earlier in the video, opens up the floodgates for way more theories. This cutscene will remain to live rent-free in my head for the rest of my life because I think it's just so cool. At the very end of the fight between Sonic and Shadow, Shadow is actually defeated and he drops the Chaos Emerald that Sonic eventually takes. However, it's not the real Chaos Emerald that Sonic takes, it's the fake Chaos Emerald that Tails left on the Ark from SA2. When Rouge pulls up on Shadow and is like, "You fell off, how did you lose to Sonic?" he actually informs her that he was, one, holding back, but two, he did in fact give up the fake Chaos Emerald to Sonic and not the real one. So Rouge devises a plan where they're going to actually swap the fake Chaos Emerald with the real Chaos Emerald right before they fight the Time Eater. The only thing that's really confusing about all this is that we don't see Rouge in Sonic's story until the very end. While Sonic does initially save Rouge the Bat, she eventually goes to find Shadow, and then she doesn't return until the very end. At no point in time during this sequence do we see Rouge somehow swap the emeralds, or put any indication that that even happens. So it is kind of a mystery. So when exactly did the emerald swap take place? Did she secretly go back to Sonic during Sonic's story? Who knows?